So when it comes to public speaking, there are three key aspects of being an effective public speaker. Content, that would be the information that you present. Structure, how well it's organized and developed. And your overall delivery or presentation. Those would be the skills and the techniques that you utilize to maintain the attention of your audience as you're presenting your speech. And all three are important. You want to have good content that's interesting and relevant to the audience. You also want to make sure that there's a logical development to the information so the audience can follow as you develop the speech and you're not going off on tangents and everything kind of connects and flows together. And you want to make sure that you're utilizing all of the available techniques when it comes to presenting the speech so that you really are doing all that you can to keep the audience into your speech and to maintain their attention throughout. Today, since we're getting to the presentation of your informative speech at the end of the week, most of you have your outlines turned in, they're done, and so now you should be practicing your delivery that you will want to execute at the end of the week when you submit your presentation. So today we're going to talk about delivery skills. And when it comes to delivering a speech effectively, there are basically 5 areas that you want to focus on. How to use your eyes effectively, how to use your voice effectively. You also want to know, and this is especially if you're speaking in person to an actual audience, you want to know how to establish and maintain a proper speaking stance. And then you also want to consider things like movement. Like, do I have to stay in the same spot? Is it okay to walk around when I'm delivering the speech? And also we want to consider gestures or getting our hands involved in the presentation to accentuate the points that we're making. So when it comes to delivery skills, we're going to look at eye contact, the vocal aspect, stance, movement, and gestures. And they're all important, and we want to learn to utilize all of them. Now, the challenge we face in this class when we're taking a public speaking class remotely is you don't get that opportunity to actually stand up in front of a live audience and deliver a speech. And we can't quite create that same dynamic doing this remotely. There's nothing like sitting there waiting for your name to be called. You're the next speaker, heart feels like it's pounding out of your chest, your mouth suddenly is getting dry, and you're just going, don't call my name, don't call my name. But they call your name. You have to walk up there, set your stance, get your eye contact focused on the audience, and then go into the presentation. So, as I'm going over delivery techniques today in this lecture, obviously I'm going to focus on the things that you need to do to deliver a speech or give a presentation remotely, but also we'll talk about the things that you would add to your delivery if you're actually speaking in front of an audience. And I'm not worried that if you have an opportunity to speak in public in front of a live audience, that you won't be able to deliver the speech. Because really, it's still just like we've been learning with public speaking, it's just a matter of understanding the delivery techniques and then practicing those over and over and over again. So I will give you some tips on what you can do when you're preparing to speak to an actual live audience, as well as understanding what you need to do well to get a good grade on your upcoming presentations in this class. So first, let's talk about eye contact. Eye contact, I think, is one of your most effective weapons as a speaker. And kind of the general rule is the more you look at your audience, the easier it is to maintain control and to keep them into the speech. So eye contact is crucial. And understand, anytime you break eye contact with the audience, you're breaking that connection that you have with the audience. So ideally, if you can give an entire presentation and you can look at the audience the entire time, that's a great skill set to have. That's why I'm a big proponent of speaking without relying on notes. And I know that sounds a little daunting, but it's really not that difficult if you really understand the technique for learning a speech. Should be based on repetition and not memorization. I never memorize speeches. And one of the reasons why is The first part of the speech will always be stronger than the last part of the speech, because when you memorize, you're just learning a section. Okay, I'll get my attention getter down. Then I'll get the rest of the intro down. Now I'll focus on main point one. Well, usually the conclusion is practice less than the other parts of the speech. So I'm real big on, when you are practicing your delivery each time, you want to go through the entire speech. And I've also been doing this long enough that I understand that just repeating your speech over and over and over again is a much better way to learn the speech as opposed to memorization. That's why you never hear me say, okay, you need to have your speeches memorized. No, you need to overlearn your speech, because what happens? That constant repetition, that's why if you simply practice your speech 3 times a day out loud a week before the presentation, you're going to have your speech down well, just because of that constant repetition. And what that repetition does, it kind of puts all that information, I kind of liken it to, if you look at your brain as having a desktop, that repetition puts all that information on the desktop. So I have quick access to that information. So if you just remember, repetition is the key to retention. And so I don't have to memorize my speech. I just practice it over and over and over and over again, till suddenly I can get through the entire speech without being dependent on my outline. That is the best way to prepare for a presentation. Now, when you're speaking remotely, in terms of eye contact, it's a little more challenging, because you're not looking at people. You're actually looking at that little dot that's right on the top of your laptop, or that camera lens that's on your phone. That's your audience. That's where your eyes need to be when you're speaking. And with some of you, I noticed with the critic speech, you kind of had it dialed in, where you learned that if I just move back a little bit, now I can kind of cheat a little, where it looks like I'm looking into the camera, but I'm actually looking at the screen, and I could read my speech. And I don't mind that, right? I don't mind for this class, while we're doing it remotely, if you finagle a way to get your outline set, kind of like a teleprompter, and you're actually looking at the outline and we can't tell. But what some of you did, and you're all learning, so I don't expect you guys to be professionals, right? This is something we should just get better and better as we go from one speech to the next. But with some of you, while you had that eye contact seemingly dialed in, we could tell just by the lack of vocal variety in your voice that you were reading your speech. So kind of on one hand, it's like, yeah, I'm meeting the eye contact requirement, but I'm not really looking at the audience. I'm looking at the speech. And the giveaway to that, we could tell by the way that you were reading your speech. Lack of vocal variety, not real conversational and personable. So realize that if you do that for your speech and you have it set so I can look at the outline, but it looks like I'm looking right into the camera lens, so I have that eye contact with those who are watching, still utilize your voice so it sounds like you're having a conversation. So rather than, and now for my next point, I will focus on what I think is real important in this speech. Now you just wonder, and so for my next point, what I want to focus on is something that I think that you're really going to enjoy about this particular topic. So I just use my voice so I sound more conversational, more personable, but I still have that eye contact dialed in. Now, completely different if you're actually giving a speech in front of an audience. And so there, yes, you want a high degree of eye contact, so you're looking out at the audience more than anywhere else. But because you can actually see everybody in the audience, you want to use what I call the roving technique in order to maintain eye contact with your audience throughout the entire speech. And all the roving technique means is, when I'm presenting the speech, I'm going to deliver a phrase to a person, phrase to a person, phrase to a person. So essentially, I'm roving from one person to the next person to the next person, and I'm working the room. And this works really well in the classroom because, you know, lights are on, everything's well lit, you can see everybody in the audience. Now, if you were in a big auditorium, you're up on the stage, you're talking to a big audience, but the lights are low in the audience, so it's really hard to actually see anyone. I still want to create that illusion of making momentary eye contact with each person in the audience. And so I'm just looking at a spot where people are, another spot where people are, another spot where people are. So again, kind of like what we're doing remotely, we're creating that illusion of making eye contact with the viewers. You would do the same thing if you're speaking to a large audience, but the difference would be if I'm actually speaking to the large audience in person, now I'm actually going to look at spots. If I'm doing it remotely, obviously I'm always looking into the camera lens. And a great way to start a speech, and you can do this when you're speaking remotely, is to always use your eye contact to establish your presence as a speaker even before you open your mouth and deliver the opening line. So for example, let's say that I'm speaking to a larger crowd in an auditorium. So when I walk up on the stage, before I begin, I'm first going to establish my stance as a speaker, and I'll show you how to do that a little bit later in today's lecture. But I set my stance, then, even before I say that first line, I'm going to look out into the audience, and I'm going to try to get eye contact with one person, a second person, and then I'll look to that third spot, and then I start with my speech. All right? So for you, obviously, you're not going to look at imaginary people when you're doing this remotely, but you can kind of delay the start. And I've mentioned this in my comments to some of you. Don't jump right into the speech. Some of you, as soon as your hand comes off record, you're starting. And so you jump right into the speech. It doesn't give you a chance to establish your presence as a speaker. So when you're doing this remotely, hit record and then look into that camera and just in your head, 1001, 1002, and then open with your attention getter. That's a great way to kind of establish your presence as a speaker. Let the audience see you first, then we go into the presentation. So with eye contact, you want to make sure that even before you begin speaking, you look at the audience first. I have their attention with my eyes, then I go into that opening line. Now, the roving technique works really well in the classroom. Same deal. I get up in front of the class. I'm giving my presentation, right? I set my stance. I look at one person, another person, and on that third person, I go right into my opening. So again, it's kind of the same thing. 1001, 1002. As I was walking through the streets of China and then I go into my presentation. So eye contact, one of your best weapons to use as a speaker, especially to keep the audience into the presentation. And then another really cool feature about eye contact when you're speaking to an actual audience, you get to see everyone. So you get to see all the reactions and you can kind of feed off that. You know, if I get someone and they're kind of nodding their head like this, I get pumped. It's like, okay, at least one person likes what I'm talking about. So I kind of pick up the energy even more. If I notice that there's a student that maybe isn't into the speech, you know, maybe I've got, you know, someone who's kind of looking down at their cell phone, kind of under their desk, they're looking down. So I can use my eyes just to bring that person back into the presentation. So I'll just focus my eye contact on that individual and keep speaking to that individual. And sooner or later, that person's going to pop their head up to see what's going on. And then it's like, oh crap, he's looking at me. I'm busted. But nothing's said, right? I just got a little smile. Okay, gotcha, back in. So I've used my eye contact to bring in a wayward audience member. So always remember that when you're speaking, be mindful of how people are reacting. If you see someone who's not really into your speech, you know, the other thing is watch for the head nods if you're speaking in class. You know, that person, and they're not trying to sleep during your speech. You know, it could be they worked the graveyard shift. Now they're in the classroom. And so you're up there speaking, and then you kind of see the head nods. When I see that, now I focus on that individual, and that head nod kind of pops up like this, and they see that eye contact. I'll wipe the drool off their side of the mouth, and then I've got them. I've looked at that person. They've seen the eye contact. Okay, cool. Back into the presentation. So use your eye contact when speaking in person to not only maintain the attention of the audience, but to bring in wayward audience members. The second technique that you really want to focus on when it comes to public speaking is to use your voice effectively. And that means controlling your rate of speaking and utilizing lots of vocal variety. You essentially want to take the audience on a vocal roller coaster so they never get comfortable with the rhythmic pattern of your voice. That's why we don't want to speak in a monotone, because it's the same rate, same volume, all the way through the speech. And what happens, it creates a redundant rhythmic pattern, which lulls the audience to sleep. Now, a lot of you are understanding the importance of vocal variety, and I'm getting vocal variety in your presentations. But what I'm seeing is I'm getting vocal variety within each of the sentences, but I'm not getting a lot of vocal variety as we go from sentence to sentence. So you want to make sure, in fact, a good rule to follow, if you really want to use your voice effectively to keep the audience into your speech, every third sentence should sound different from the previous two. So you don't want every line to sound the same, every line to sound the same, every line to sound the same. Even if there's kind of a nice vocal pattern in each of the lines, still you want to break out of that redundant rhythmic pattern. So that means every third line, I'm either going to slow down, soften my tone, or I'm going to pick up the rate and pick up the volume. So a good way to incorporate vocal variety, just pretend when you're speaking, you have a little knob that controls your volume, how loud or how soft you speak. And you also have a knob over here for your rate, how fast you're going to speak or how slow you speak. And you just want to constantly twist those knobs all the way through the presentation. Don't let your audience get comfortable with your rhythmic pattern. And again, if you're speaking in person, and if you feel like you're kind of losing the audience, not seeing a lot of eye contact, just pause mid-sentence and hold that pause for 1001, 1002, 1003, and all of a sudden you'll see the heads pop up and look at you. Oh, did I miss something? So anytime you want to just snap the audience back to attention, just pause. Wait till you get people looking and then go into the presentation. And don't be afraid to use pauses when you're speaking in public. Pauses are great. They give the audience time to take in your words. You can also use pauses effectively to create vocal variety by just switching where you put a pause in a phrase, sometimes earlier in the phrase, sometimes in the middle, sometimes a little bit later, and then following the pause, soften your tone and slow your rate down. Great way to incorporate vocal variety into the presentation. The other thing that I like about pauses, and this is especially when you're speaking in front of an audience, if the audience is used to me using pauses, that also gives me more time to get out of what I call dilemmas in a speech. And this happens to everyone, especially if you really get to the point where you can give a presentation without relying on your notes. Because so much of this is concentration. And so this happens to me all the time too in the classroom. I'll be talking about a particular point, and then I'll forget for a second, wait, where was I going with this actual point? But instead of panicking, right, breaking my eye contact with the audience and getting flustered, I just hold my eye contact on the audience and pause. Figure out where I want to go next. And as long as I don't break that eye contact, audience won't know that you have no idea what that next line is. So it's good to work pauses into your normal delivery style. So that way, if you need a second or two to figure out what you want to say next in the speech, as long as you hold the pause and don't break your eye contact, audience will not have a clue. So remember, when it comes to vocal variety, don't forget to incorporate pauses, also along with changing up your rate and your volume. The next thing that I want to talk about is, and this is especially true if you're speaking in front of an audience, but also for this class, a few of you, you've given some of your presentations standing, and that is great, but you want to make sure that you know how to establish a proper stance. Now, I've got a little video on setting a stance for public speaking that I'm going to add to the end of this lecture. But basically, what I'm going to tell you in that little segment is when it comes to setting up a proper public speaking stance, a couple things that you want to consider. One, when you set your stance, you always want your feet same width as your shoulders. So you want a nice balanced stance. You don't want your stance too wide. That just makes you shorter, shrinks your height, and it looks a little bit weird. And you don't want your feet together because then you're kind of like swaying in the wind. So in terms of a proper speech stance, feet same width as your shoulders. Then, real important, make sure you balance your weight evenly on each leg. Mistake that a lot of speakers make with their stance, they get up there, they set their stance, but they have all their weight on one leg or the other. And then after about a minute, one of two things will happen. Your leg falls asleep and then you tip over, or what most of us do, starts to fall asleep. So what do? We shift the weight to our other leg. Usually what creates a swaying motion when someone's up giving a speech is they're not balancing their weight evenly on each leg. So they're just rocking from side to side. You prevent that by making sure that your weight is evenly distributed in both of your legs. And then you want to make sure too that you kind of sit down in your stance. What I mean by that is kind of focus your weight back on your heels rather than on the balls of your feet. You get that weight kind of moving forward. Then when you're speaking, you get all that extra adrenaline. And then what happens, you start bouncing up on your toes. You almost look like one of those Pentecostal preachers. And I'll say unto you, prevent that by making sure you sit down in your stance, keep your weight on your heels. So you've got a nice, firm stance, weight evenly balanced. Now, the next thing is movement. Like, do I need to stay in that position or is it okay to move? Here's the basic rule on movement when it comes to public speaking. If movement is purposeful, then it's cool to move. But if it's just random movement, that just creates a distraction. And so what I mean by that is you want to make sure that you control your stance. And if you decide to move or walk to another spot on the stage when you're speaking, you want to do that when it's a good time to move. So with movement and public speaking, the best time to move is always when you go from one section to the next. Like when you go from your introduction into your first main point, that's a good time to move in a speech. Another time to move or walk to another position when you're giving a presentation. So on your transitions, when you go from one point to the next, if you move and actually take a couple steps to another position, you're physically demonstrating the fact that we're moving from one section to the next. And if you want to see an example of that movement, when we get to the persuasive speeches, on the sample speeches, make sure you check out the video by Tyler Tuilau. He does a persuasive speech, but he incorporates what we call the speaker's triangle. That's just a little method that guides your movement when you're giving a presentation and you're moving on the transitions. So movement is good in a speech if there's a reason to move. Another great time to move. And sometimes it may be that you're speaking from behind a podium. So if that's the case, unless you have a mic on that's connected to you, that's wireless, if you move, the audience won't be able to hear you. So sometimes you can't move. You're staying right behind the podium. But even if you're behind the podium and you think that if I move out from the podium, I can project my voice so the audience can still hear me, nice little touch at the end of the speech. Once you get to your conclusion and you start with the preview, just kind of move around to the side of the podium. Now you're a little bit closer to the audience. What I would teach you in the classroom, if we're using the speaker's triangle for movement, what we're actually going to do with our movement is we're going to move closer and closer to the audience. So when it comes to movement, you never want to move backwards. You always want to work closer and closer. You should always be closer to the audience at the end of the speech than you were at the beginning, unless, of course, you can't move because you're speaking from behind a podium. So movement is good, but it must be purposeful. We don't want constant swaying and moving and all kinds of random motion because that creates a distraction. Then the final thing, and probably the more challenging aspect of public speaking, is to figure out what you're going to do with your hands when you're giving a presentation, and that's what we would call gestures. And some of you have gestured with your presentation when you're delivering your speech online, and that's fine. It's just harder to do remotely because I don't have much room to gesture. And an important rule about gesturing is I don't want my hands to ever get above my shoulders. So I never want my hands in front of my face, in my hair, if I'm wearing glasses, playing with my glasses, scratching the side of my face, hands away from the face. So when it comes to gestures, don't let your hands get above your shoulders. But still, that doesn't give me a lot of room to gesture. So it's a little bit different depending on the style that you're going to use when you deliver your speech. If you're standing up delivering your speech and you're far enough away to really utilize full gestures, cool. And for those of you that I've mentioned need to pick up the energy a little bit more, and I don't quite know how to explain it, but I just know it's true. If you get your hands more involved, the more you use gestures, the more energetic your delivery becomes. So if you're one of those folks that said, hey, nice job on your critic speech, but let's pick the energy up, just try to get your hands involved a little bit more. And in terms of gestures, as far as where to gesture, where not to gesture, just think of a rectangle that's in front of your body that starts at your shoulders, goes all the way down to your waist. Never want to gesture below the waist, so always bring your hands up. It looks funny if you're standing like this and then you're kind of gesturing like this, looks like you're scooping dirt on the audience. So always make sure if you gesture, bring your hands up above your waist, and you also want to make sure that kind of your palms are out. Try not to clasp your hands when you're speaking because then you just create another distraction. I can't rub the lotion in all the way. You're yanking on fingers. We certainly don't want to do that when you're speaking. So in terms of gesturing, above the waist, below the shoulders, and kind of anything in this rectangle will work. And I would rather have you err using more gestures than not enough. So maybe for the informative speech, just kind of let your hands go and see what happens. And a lot of the times, hey, well, how do I figure out how to gesture and what looks natural? Best way to figure out what your natural gestures are, just pay attention to what you're doing with your hands the next time you're in a conversation. Because we use our hands all the time when we're talking. Those are your natural gestures. So let's just kind of figure out what those gestures are and get those involved in the presentation. So when it comes to delivery, we want to make sure that we've got our eye contact dialed in. We're using our voice effectively, especially using lots of vocal variety, incorporating pauses into the presentation. We want to make sure that we have a proper stance if we're standing. We want to make sure that our movement is purposeful and not random. And we want to get gestures involved in our presentation because the more we gesture, the more energetic we can sound. And last thing that I'll tell you when it comes to delivery, probably the most important thing I can tell you, just be yourself. Just being yourself adds so much to your overall delivery because nobody else is like you. Nobody looks like you exactly. Nobody sounds like you exactly. So those are all unique qualities about yourself that make you valuable, that make you stand out as a speaker. That's why with some of you on the comments, I've really said, hey, just talk to the audience like you're talking to friends. Be yourself, be natural, let your personality come out in the presentation. And unless you're doing a serious persuasive speech, it's also okay to smile. So every once in a while, just smiling with your audience, a chuckle here, facial expressions that show I'm really trying to connect with the audience. All of those are great qualities to have when you're giving a speech. And for the next two presentations, for the informative speech and the persuasive speech, for both those presentations, in order to get an A for the class at the end of the semester, and remember, up to this point, getting that A is all about how well you accomplish your goals, how hard you work to accomplish those goals you set at the start of the semester. But also, in order to get an A, I want to make sure that you're mastering the student learning outcomes for this class. And one of those is to learn how to practice effectively. If you want to show me that you practice your speech and practice your speech effectively, then in the presentation of the informative speech and the presentation of the persuasive speech, I want your eyes on the camera at least 50% of the time. So if you want to get an A in this class, you've got to make sure that your eye contact is there at least half the time. So, and that's not bad. That means half the time I can kind of glance down, see the next line. Also, too, when it comes to eye contact, don't break your eye contact unless there's a reason to do so. I've noticed with a few of you, you're speaking and then you kind of look up off to the side, right? Kind of look over here, right? So I know you're not looking at your notes. So you want to make sure that you never break eye contact with the audience unless there's a reason to do so. So when you're giving your presentation, the only reason that you wouldn't be looking at the camera is if you're taking a second to glance at your notes. But for the informative and the persuasive, to get that final grade of A for the semester, show me you know how to practice. The way you can exhibit that is by maintaining a high degree of eye contact at least half the time in both of those two speeches. Is really what I want out of you for this class is for you to accomplish your goals. I also want you to understand the importance of practice when it comes to public speaking. And again, I've said that before and I'll say it again. You want to be an effective speaker, just put in the work, put in the practice. It's not that difficult if you do the work. And that practice helps us to conquer the greatest fear that we have when it comes to public speaking, and that's that nervous anxiety, that uncomfortable feeling. Well, the more you practice, the better you're going to control that anxiety. Prove it to me by making sure that you're looking at the camera at least half the time. And then the other thing I want to make sure you get out of this class is you know how to put an academic speech outline together that's completely structured, has all the source citations in completely. So now as we're getting to the last half of the semester, to get that A, accomplish your goals, but also make sure in the final two big speeches, eye contact with the camera at least 50% of the time, and that you do a good job on your outlines. All right? Hey, practice hard this week. Now, each time that you read your speech out loud, you can practice one of the specific delivery techniques that we learned today. All right? Practice makes perfect. Practice is going to give you that confidence that you're searching for when it comes to public speaking. So do the work. And it's not going to take much time. 20 minutes a day, all the way to Friday, 3 times a day, read your speech out loud from the outline. I know you can do it.